I've heard that tariffs are all the rage now. Much has been said about it, but I will try to bring more detail and calculation into this issue. Tariffs are very complex and dynamic, so I will need an entire series to thoroughly unpack their effect on prices, employment and budget. In this first video, I want to focus on prices. I'll start with the simpler case of tariffs on finished products and then turn to the more complicated cases. I'll use cars for the first hypothetical example. Let's say that a European car maker ships a finished car to USA. For the sake of simplicity, let's assume that the car maker sells it directly to the American dealership that then sells it to the individual customers. The dealership pays $50,000 for the car and sells it for $55,000, making a profit of $5,000 or a 10% margin. The government then imposes 20% tariffs on foreign cars. Suddenly, the American dealership has to pay $10,000 per car to the federal government on top of the $50,000 to the car maker, pushing the cost to $60,000. Obviously, it can no longer sell those cars for $55,000 as it would result in a significant loss instead of profit. The dealership has no choice but to increase the price or go bankrupt. If it wanted to retain its previous profit per car, it would have to increase the price by the full amount of the tariff, that is, to $65,000. But what would it do to the sales? Such a rapid increase would most likely lead to a sharp drop in sales, as such car would suddenly be much more expensive than comparable models of the domestic competitors. A more probable scenario is that the dealer would somewhat decrease its margin and would try to negotiate with the foreign car maker to do the same and supply the cars with some discount. It's in the interest of both of them to keep the demand for those cars as high as possible by limiting the price increase for the final customers. So the first order consequence of tariffs is that the price of the imported goods will increase for the final customer, but you probably already know that. There are, however, a few takeaways you may not have thought about. Takeaway number 1. Products with lower margin are more likely to get significantly more expensive after tariff imposition compared with high-margin products. Think about it. If the margin is only 10% and the tariff 20%, there is little room for the company to absorb the tariffs. However, if the margin on the imported product was 60%, the price increase following the same tariff might be minuscule or even non-existent, depending on. Takeaway number 2. The price change following tariffs depends on the elasticity of the demand for the product. This is an economist's way of saying how much will the sales decrease given a price increase. Inelastic demand would mean that following the 20% price hike, there would be much smaller drop in sales, let's say 3%. While highly elastic demand would lead to more than proportional drop in sales, let's say 50%. The goal of businesses is to maximize profit, which in the short term can be simplified as margin per unit times units sold. This suggests that they would try to maximize the result of this equation, with a caveat I will mention later. In economics classes, the demand and supply are nice curves. In reality, the management of the companies is trying to find the sweet spot based on their guesstimates, sometimes known as McKinsey analysis. There is also a good deal of trial and error, so the tariff-induced price changes may take some time to settle. So what variables influence the elasticity of the demand? Firstly, the product type. People will continue buying products which are, or at least they think they are, necessary. If gasoline price increases, people just cannot stop driving to work or to the grocery store. They may cut some unnecessary drives here and there, but the demand is quite inelastic. When talking about tariffs, the second point is perhaps the most important, and that is the domestic competition in that product. If you are taking blood pressure medication from Switzerland, you won't simply stop taking it or even change the dose because of price change after tariffs, since it is a necessity. But if there is just a suitable medication from a domestic producer and it suddenly becomes relatively cheaper, you may switch. Another influencing factor is whether it is a strong brand with loyal customer base or rather a generic product. You probably won't care all that much whether you buy apples from Morocco or Spain, so generic products tend to be price sensitive. However, unlike apples, you will care whether you buy the Apple or other smartphone brand. Loyal customers are more lenient towards price increases. If you love Mercedes, you will probably stick to it even if it gets more expensive. Well, I mean the car, not the Hispanic chick from high school. Nonetheless, if such expensive product gets even more expensive, you may wait an additional year before buying it, as you need to save more money. Which is the last point I will mention with regards to demand elasticity. If the price of a product is very significant relative to people's income and wealth, even if they don't switch brand after the tariff price hike, just delaying the purchase will be registered by the seller as sales drop. So far, I've talked about the interaction between the seller and the final customer. I want to briefly turn to the dynamic between the exporter and the importer. In our example, the foreign car maker and the dealership. Although in reality, we often have even more intermediaries. So how will the price negotiations look like among them? I'll start with this interesting insight. Remember when I said that both the dealership and the car maker will probably slightly cut their price? The takeaway number 3 is that the price cut on the side of the exporter is more meaningful, as cutting the import value will also decrease the tariff that the importer has to pay. In this example, if the European car maker sells the car to the American dealership for $49,000 instead of $50,000, the dealership will save not only the $1,000 on the purchase price, but also the additional $200 on the 20% tariff. The higher the tariff percentage rate, the higher the leverage on the side of the exporter. Of course, this doesn't mean that the exporter will cut more. The actual negotiation depends on a myriad of variables with incredibly complex dynamic, which is hard to generalize in any meaningful way. Still, I want to provide you with a few takeaways. One factor is a rehash of takeaway number 1. The party with the higher margin is the one with larger maneuvering room. Both car makers and dealerships tend to have rather low profit margin in percentage terms. But if the exporting firm had, for example, 30% margin and the importer only 10%, the potential to provide a discount and therefore limit the price increase to the final customer is higher on the side of the exporter with the higher margin, and vice versa. So far, I have talked about gross margin, that is revenue from selling the product minus the variable costs such as raw materials and costs of manufacturing the car in our example. But it is better to consider net margin, which includes all the costs such as marketing, R&D, costs of capital such as interest expense or dividends, taxes, and the bureaucratic overhead such as the HR department. Two companies may have the same gross margin, but very different net margin. And the latter is what determines the company's ability to provide a discount in the face of tariffs, which is takeaway number 4. An additional variable is how important an export destination is the country that imposed the tariffs for the exporting company. If that country is crucial, the exporter faces a conundrum. In the face of the tariffs, it can expect a drop in sales. If it sells the goods to the importer with discount, it will get the double whammy of lower sales and lower profit from each product. But if it doesn't decrease the price, it will probably lead to even larger slump in sales. So if this one country is the dominant source of revenue, the exporter is in a much more complicated situation than a business whose operation is diversified. The final decision of whether to discount or not will be strongly influenced by the elasticity of the demand I mentioned earlier. The next point sounds super obvious, but economists sometimes forget about it, which is takeaway number 5. The price negotiations between those businesses depends on their relative power. So for example, the multi-billion-dollar Volkswagen Group has much stronger stance than a small American dealership. Conversely, a small niche European clothing brand that tries to sell in America through Neiman Marcus is the party with much less power.
There are no pacts between lions and men.
The rest I will leave for the second part of this video. Today, I went through the price dynamic of imported goods, focusing specifically on finished products. In the second part, I will show you the likely reaction of domestic competition to tariffs and then go deeper by adding the complication of tariffs on input materials and adding the time dimension. For now, stay unconventional.